Great. Bit scary being up here with Liz.
Come on, let's get on with it.
Okay. So
Such a one for preamble.
I think we start with Liz telling us what she means by stronger and family.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's stronger and not strong. Okay, so it doesn't matter where we're at. It might be that you're thinking that you're in some kind of, 4 out of 10 family or something, and you're trying to get to, a higher grade. It's not like that. It's not like that at all. Wherever we're at, we can all get stronger. Okay, so it's really inclusive. It's stronger, not strong. Okay, that's how I'm thinking of stronger.
Relative,
yeah.
Okay. But we do all need families, and we can't help it. We wouldn't be here if we somehow hadn't been and born into a family. Families are people you're stuck with, no matter how irritating or how difficult that family is. And that applies to the church family as well as to natural relations. And that's not to say there aren't times when, very sadly, people do need, for different reasons, to actually break away from their natural family as far as possible. But they're still connected by blood, of course. Okay. So what do we mean by family? We're going to ask you that.
Yeah, we need to think about this, don't we? So let's just wonder what's in your mind about family. Well, obviously there's the nuclear family, mum and dad and 2.4 children. That's family. Okay? So what other kind of ideas have you got in your mind? How else could we think of family in a way that will be helpful for us when we're thinking about stronger families? What other sort of groupings do you think of as family?
Good friends.
Good friends. How is a friendship circles different from family? Let's think about that.
Let's just let them have a chance to say other things.
This is called dialogical teaching.
Yeah. Others. Thank you, Barbara.
Blended families.
Pardon, Johnny?
Blended families.
Yeah, good.
People that we live with in the same house.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Like Craig even.
Others.
Extended family, intergeneration.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Work colleagues.
Possibly, yeah.
Spent most of my life at work. So.
Yeah. Some working communities call themselves families, don't they? They use the word family. Mine did. Church.
Let's hope that church is family. Yeah, definitely.
Adoption.
Yeah.
Great.
People have been adopted. That's a very Christian idea.
So lower years school classrooms maybe.
Okay, thank you, yeah. Talk about family groupings within schools.
The family of God.
Okay,
One
the
big
family of God.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, let's sort of go there a little bit more. Ephesians 3, verses 14 to 15. I'm going to read the beginning. This is the beginning of a really famous prayer. It's not the prayer we're looking at. It's what Paul says in the introduction. This is how he introduces this great prayer. He says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name." Listen to that. See if you can get your head around what it might mean. I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name.
So in my version, in the NLT, it says, I fall to my knees and pray to the Father, the creator of everything in heaven and earth. So that's a bit different, isn't it?
That's a bit different, Liz, and it sort of makes sense. But in my Bible, which is an NIV, and by the way, the NIV sort of changes. They keep doing adaptations to it. So you find different translations in NIVs. I got a footnote. Some of you have that. And it points out something really interesting. It points out that the word for father and for family in Greek are almost identical. So Paul's readers would know that the father and the family are almost the same word. Father in Greek is pater. Family is patria. So Paul is sort of using that play on words and saying, I'm kneeling before the Father. Every family is named after him because he's the pater and they're the patria. And I think Paul has something in his mind that is really important as he uses that play on word. He is thinking that the Father God is the source of everything because he made it, humanity included. And what I love to say, and say quite often when I'm talking about this sort of thing, is that creation is the fruit, the love between, or the result of the love between God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God birthed the cosmos. It was an act of love. And human beings are included in that. And that's what gives us the idea that is spoken of in the Bible in a few places as God as Father of all. However, humanity's gone its own way and turned its back on God, falling out of relationship with him. So God's family has gone upside down. God's family is out of joint, big time. And God has devised a way to heal the rift. We call it the gospel. So the notion of the fatherhood of God comes to maturity in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are fallen. We begin life like the prodigal son ended up, far away from the Father. But the love of God through the gospel as shown in Jesus Christ, his death, his resurrection in our place, that makes it possible for us to come into relationship with the Father, to be redeemed, to be restored, for the family to be put right. And that's what God longs for. And we actually have the term adoption. It's possible for people to be adopted into God's family. So the gospel fully reveals God as Father, loving, sacrificial, righteous, just, forgiving, compassionate, long-suffering, patient, and so on.
So this way of talking, I hope you can see, really is very inclusive. It's not exclusive. It's very easy for the idea of family to be exclusive. This is a very inclusive idea of family. And I love the idea that it's a kind of model for us on the microcosm of our families, whatever we think of as our family, those people that we're committed to. It's a kind of, we can look to God and the way that he is the great father of mankind. We can look to him as a model for our families, for something that we can aspire to.
Yeah, and don't forget, this inclusive element is really shown through the Bible in both the Hebrew Bible, which is what we call the Old Testament, and in the Christian Bible, which is Old Testament and New Testament. It's there in both places because in the Bible, the family is sort of a household. There are people who are in relationship with each other, but it's much bigger than that. And it's the same in some countries in the world. You know, we've been to Afghanistan where there are several families living in one compound together. It's like a big household. And they live together and relate to each other. And there are people who come in to help, who are considered to be part of the family, the household. That's what a Hebrew family was like. It was much bigger than just those who were related to each other. And it's the same in the New Testament. You read about households. And we've got a lovely, lovely chapter in the Bible that I think was used in Glendale not long ago, in Proverbs 31, where it talks about, somebody was talking about stronger women and referred to it. Who did stronger women?
Paula.
Yeah, Paula, and she really referred to that chapter. Beautiful. And you can see that the woman was given responsibility for the household. The male often went outside the home and did the sort of jobs outside the home relating to other people and bringing money in. But the woman had a very, very important place in the home, running the whole household, really inclusive. And there are instructions in the Old Testament about the importance of looking after strangers, people who are not even part of the same nationality, if they're around, visiting them, hosting them, looking after them. And so often in the Hebrew Bible, it says, don't forget, you were slaves in Egypt. You were treated so badly in the end. You welcome those people in. Don't treat them badly. So it's a really inclusive situation.
So a stronger family is not one that gets so sort of tight in on itself that it can't welcome
Definitely
in
not.
others. It
It
needs to be
opens the
an
doors.
elastic one. Now, it seemed to us that the story, which I hope you're all familiar with, because we're not going to read it, of the prodigal son, is quite an interesting story to base some of our thinking on about how we might make our families stronger. Because in that family, it's a very good example of a family with some strengths and also some weaknesses. So I think we can learn some things from that.
Okay, so it's the story of a father and two sons. The mother or the wife isn't mentioned. She's probably got a really important place, but it's a, what do you call it? Society?
Patriarchal.
That's the word. Patriarchal society.
I wonder if some of the problems is because it's just three blokes and anyway.
Yeah. It's really useful having somebody up here. It's really useful having Liz up here so she can fill in the words that I forgot. Great, thanks Liz. So it's a patriarchal society, but also it is a parable, but we're going to use it in a different way to a parable because I think mostly we should use the parables for one lesson. That's how Jesus was speaking them. But we're going to look at it as a story of a family.
This was my idea, he's just giving in.
That's quite true, actually. I said, how can you use the parable like that? Anyway, off we go. So, there's a father, he has two sons, everything's probably looking really fine to the outsiders. He's got a really nice farm, they're prosperous, the boys are helping out, and dad is loving his sons, and he's really proud of them, but who knows what's bubbling under the surface? Later events show us that the garden was not full of roses.
And it is like that, isn't it? It's terribly easy to look at other people's families and think they're perfect, everything's going fine for them. But it really just isn't like that, is it? So this is very much something we can all relate to, isn't it? Those feelings, there must have been feelings of discontent. Things left unsaid that should have been said. People just never getting around to having a proper discussion. Never really raising issues. Someone, everyone wants to do it, but the right moment to talk about some important things never comes. These are the kinds of things that happen in families, and it can go on for years like this. Things being swept under the carpet. We just don't want to talk about that. Family members realise there are expectations of them, maybe especially young people, thinking, oh, my dad really wants me to do this, my mum expects me to do that, there are expectations on me, I'm not comfortable with them, I don't really want that to happen, but I don't want to say so, there's going to be disappointments, I'm feeling disappointed. And in the end, of course, it all implodes. And the younger son, I hope you do know the story, says, I want my money now and I want to be independent. I want to follow my dream. And again, that's also a very familiar thing that happens in families. There's a disconnect between what different members of a family thought was going on, a disconnect between what they were expecting, what they were hoping for, but nobody really wants to talk about it. And I think somehow, that's something we need to think about. We can't always talk everything through and get resolutions. A lot of things don't have simple solutions. But I suppose learning how to really communicate and deciding when the right time is to have difficult conversations is probably something we need to think about, and we want the courage to do so.
So the father has to make a decision. And under the circumstances, maybe it's really sensible. Maybe he has seen this coming for a while and felt helpless, not able to stop it. And realizing that the son needs to be given his head, he gives him the money and lets him go. And the boy is off with a swagger. Sometimes being a stronger family means letting go. Sometimes it means just trusting God because we've run out of ideas about how we can actually deal with the situation. Sometimes it does mean bearing pain for a short while, or maybe for a much longer time. You get the feeling that everything went on reasonably well at home on the farm, probably smaller now, fewer people to do the work, and a father who's sad and preoccupied.
So maybe if this family, one of their issues was communication, lack of communication, maybe they need to be stronger in that. But I suppose we also need to learn to live with difference. And this is what God is like, isn't it? If you think about Jesus in the Gospels, he let people walk away. He accepted people's differences. He accepted the choices that people made and often felt really sad about that. And in terms of living with difference, at the end of the story, we know that the older son was very upset. He vents his anger right at the end. And clearly there was a lack of communication between him and his dad. He loves his son, but he's not been able to communicate that. I think that's another thing which we're familiar with that happens in families, that we can go on year after year after year, and somehow we don't really communicate to a member of the family that we do love them. We don't show them that we love them. We take that for granted. And that's something that maybe we need to think about. God shows his love to us. He did it really clearly. And we need to be people like that, like our Heavenly Father. Or maybe that lad, that older son, maybe he just couldn't. Maybe his character was such that he couldn't receive his father's love. He needed to be shown love differently. And when we think about in Ephesians, it talks about we need to look to each other's needs. And we need to do that within our families. We're better probably at doing that sometimes with people outside of our families. Within our families, within whatever groupings we feel is that group that we belong to, whether that's our life group or a particular friendship group or the extended family or whatever that group is, that need to look to the needs of the other. What can I do to meet that person's need?
Yeah, we're not completely following a script here, but there was a line that Liz had written down that I might have interrupted. She said, that she couldn't help feeling that these three blokes could have done with some lessons in communication.
Or maybe they need to go one of those love languages courses. That's what I thought. Maybe.
Yeah, but maybe not all women are brilliant at communication either.
No, all right then, carry on.
Okay, fine. Anyway, the massive thing that happened is that the younger son came back, repentant. He'd learnt his lesson whilst he was away. We don't know how long it took. It's a story. It might have taken years, and certainly the description in the story makes you think it did take a really long time. And the point is that we can see the big picture in the story is that the father is completely ready to forgive. That's really amazing. Of course, the son showed immense courage in coming home and admitting that he'd done wrong. And being willing to admit where we're wrong is a really big key to stronger families. Being able to say, okay, I've been in the wrong here. I'm really sorry. That's what happened in this story. The son was willing to say that he was sorry. He was desperate to get back in the family, in relationship. Sometimes parents need to say sorry to children. Maybe sometimes parents need to say sorry to adult children about things that have happened in the past if they realise mistakes that they've made. And so all of our families will be stronger if we develop this ability to allow each other to fail, to be accepted, to be forgiven. Kindness, such a simple word. Kindness and generosity are wonderful qualities in families, but sadly, they can be places, that's our families, can be places where kindness and generosity are least often found because we become so familiar with each other, so fed up with each other's mistakes, that it all becomes unkind and ungenerous. And we say far worse things to those people who are close to us than we would ever dream of saying to people outside of our families. It's much easier to be rude and mean to family members than to people outside. That's a tragedy, and it really weakens and ruins families.
And think about forgiveness, unforgiveness. I know that some of us are in families where unforgiveness is travelling down through the generations. And it gets to a point where somebody's got to have the courage to break the cycle. It might be other things travelling down through generations. And at some point, somebody's got to say, enough now. And I think, when sometimes we hear stories of ways in which that can happen, and that is an amazing freedom. That is a Christian way of being. That is being godlike. This father in this story had enormous capacity for forgiveness and for graciousness. If you think about it, the intervening years could easily have turned him into a bitter old man, stewing over what his son has done, stirring offence round and round, feeling resentful and let down, and thinking, after all I did for him. But instead of that, he allowed himself to feel increasing love for the boy. He missed him. Maybe he mused on what could I done differently. Maybe he felt he had played some part in the boy's feeling so restless. Do you know, it's so easy in families to make bad situations worse. I have to confess, I think I've often done this through allowing my own feelings of hurt or fear to get the better of me. We really need to guard against this if we want stronger families. We need to rise above it and look at a different way of doing things. We need the way that God can help us is to give us that quality of being able to see things what they are, to make bad situations better and not worse.
And then there's the issue of the son who was home. We're not spending much time on this. His jealousy, really, really, really understandable that he felt angry when the son who'd been away was welcomed in. Maybe the father hadn't shown him the love that he perhaps craved. Maybe he had a longing for love that he wasn't getting and felt the absent son was receiving the sort of love of his father in his absence. And his father was perhaps so overcome with his sadness at the absent son that maybe he didn't give attention to the son who was there. But then, when the son returned, we're told that the father embraced him, and there's some wonderful art being produced around this. I'm sure a lot of us have seen many representations of the father hugging the son in famous artwork. How great it is sometimes just to receive a hug that says everything and no words are needed. An embrace, a hug can go a really long way and carry so much meaning, especially in a family.
I think it's really beautiful too, the way that the father, if you remember at the end of the story, the older son won't come into the party, to the celebration. He stays outside. And the father leaves the celebration and he goes out to him. And the boy explodes with, "This isn't fair, you never did that for me." And all of a sudden, it's all pouring out of him what he is dissatisfied about. And you see that father reaching to him. He goes out to him. He doesn't say, "Send him to me, I'll have a chat with him." He goes to him and he says to him, "My dear son." So again, there's that sort of endearment, there's that love. "My dear son, you're always with me. Everything I've got is yours." Again, we haven't sort of communicated again. We've been on a different page over this. But I think that's a really beautiful picture of him going out to speak to his older son and reaching out to him. That's what God does with us. And that's what we should be doing in our families when people upset us and hurt us and have a bit of a blow up about how they're feeling. "Oh no, I didn't realise you felt like that. I'm so sorry. I'm coming out to you."
Okay, so we're coming to a conclusion now, and I just want to say as we come to conclusion, this is the biggest thing I think on our hearts as we were preparing this. It's really easy when you're preaching. Sometimes it's somehow you get mind blocks, and you're going for it, and you're saying what it should be like, and you've got people who are actually going through real, serious, practical situations which feel completely hopeless, and they feel completely helpless, and they think, "What's the good of this for me?" And we know that there are families which have situations like that within our church fellowship. We know that. We've really got that on our hearts as we share. And it's really, really tough. And I love the thing that I said earlier, thinking that God is the Father of all, and he has an aching heart for those who don't acknowledge him and are away from him. And he's given his all to deal with that. But somehow he's leaving it to people to make the response. And I think these verses from Psalm 68 show the heart of God for us all, and the heart of God as Father. Verse 4 of Psalm 68 shows God as being so great. Sing to God, sing in praise of his name, extol him who rides on the clouds, rejoice before him. His name is the Lord. What's he like? He's a father to the fatherless. He's a defender of widows. God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing. But the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. God's heart is for people who are broken. That's why Jesus came.
So the nuclear and extended families are great building blocks for society, even when they're not perfect, and they never are. And yeah, Andy and I have really been thinking, as we've been preparing this, about the knowledge that we have of some people in our church family who are living day in, day out, feeling overwhelmed by the problems in their families, feeling that they're the only ones who are somehow holding everything up, feeling that there's no one in their family who they really relate to and they're really supporting each other, feeling that there's so much brokenness in their family that it's all a bit hopeless. And even feeling some people that this is what it was like when I was a kid, this is how it was with my parents, as far as I know it was like this with my grandparents. And feeling that nothing's ever going to change. And the message of the gospel is that it can and it should. That having Christ with us means that there is always hope of restoration. There is always, the gospel is about redemption. It's about restoring things. And we don't really know what God is going to restore in these families. I've got to say this. He's pinching me. We don't know what God is going to restore. And we'll pray for the things we want. But it is wonderful to see that God does restore things in families. And I do just want to tell you this story. So I have a sister who's 4 years older than me. And, I was 50. And I must have been older than that. We were in our 50s before I was able to have a conversation with her, which I should have had decades before. And in that conversation, I was able to say to her, I know what you suffered as a child. I was there. And that made a massive difference to her. I can remember we were in Marlborough, she cried and cried. And I don't know why I took that long to tell her, because she'd felt alone and thought she'd imagined it. And she said to me, why didn't Mum love me? Well, she was in her late 60s by the time Mum was in her nearly 90 and about to die. And Mum said to her one day, probably a couple of months before she died, I didn't treat you right when you were a child, and I'm sorry. It took all that time, what a waste. But I have seen my sister become a different person as she approached 70. It's a real sad thing that it took that long, and it did blight her life, because she was wrongly treated by my mother. But God did, in the end, restore to her something that she needed.
Thank you, Liz. I didn't know Liz was going to share that. So it's not about nothing going wrong. The story of the gospel is all about something that's gone drastically wrong with God's world. So going wrong is the story of the gospel. It's also the story of the prodigal son. But God is a God of redemption. He is a God of restoration. He's a God of hope. He's a God of love. And we say Christ makes it possible. Christ makes it possible. He points the way in what he has done. Becoming stronger families is about practicing true love as per 1 Corinthians 13. We discussed whether we'd read that chapter. We're not going to. It's really worth reading 1 Corinthians 13 again and again. Becoming stronger families is about practicing that true love, which involves patience. And God's patience is about long suffering, which means that on the way there are massive trials and you stick at it. And it's about seeing our way through difficulties with God's help. And when you're part of God's people, with the support of the church family, as much as we can share with the church family. And we don't want to be talking about our stories to everybody. So there are stories that need to be held in serious confidence. But it's good to share and to walk alongside each other. God is a God of love. He's a God of redemption. He's a God of restored relationships. He's Father. We're his people if we've come to him through Christ. And isn't this what families need to make them stronger?